Hey, Urban Explorers, welcome back to the Urbanist Lens. It's your host, Drew, coming to you live from my thankfully pigeon-free apartment in New York.
And I'm Clark, also enjoying the relative peace and quiet of my Brooklyn brownstone. Those pigeons can get pretty aggressive, I hear ya.
Seriously, they're like the tiny feathered mob bosses of the city. Anyway, enough about our avian woes. Let's get into today's discourse.
Today we're venturing all the way down under to Victoria, Australia. They're projected to hit a staggering 8 million residents by the early 2030s.
8 million, that's like almost 3 times the population of my entire home state. So how do you even begin to plan for that kind of growth?
Well, you start with something called demographic projections. It's not exactly a crystal ball, but it's the closest thing urban planners have to predicting the future.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these projections. What do they look at?
They take into account all sorts of factors: birth rates, death rates, migration patterns, even age distribution. It's like a giant, complex equation that helps them understand not just how many people there will be, but also what their needs will be.
So it's not just about adding more houses. It's about anticipating the strain on things like schools, hospitals, transportation.
Exactly. And the results of these projections are fascinating. For example, in Victoria, they're seeing a growing demand for public transportation, especially in those outer suburbs.
Makes sense. If you have 8 million people trying to cram onto the freeway, you're going to have a bad time.
Right. So the planners are using these projections to guide investments in things like expanding train lines and bus routes, creating more bike lanes. It's all about trying to avoid becoming the next Los Angeles where everyone's stuck in traffic for hours.
Speaking of avoiding urban sprawl, one of the big strategies I keep seeing in these reports is this idea of densification.
Densification is all about making better use of the space we already have. Instead of sprawling outwards and gobbling up green space, it's about creating more compact, walkable neighborhoods within existing urban areas.
So more like building up instead of out. I've seen some pretty cool examples of that in European cities, like those mixed-use buildings where you have shops and apartments all in one structure.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Traditional zoning often segregates residential areas from commercial areas, forcing people to rely on cars to get around. But with mixed-use development and densification, you can have your apartment, your grocery store, your favorite cafe, maybe even your office, all within walking distance.
That sounds amazing. Sign me up.
And the benefits go beyond convenience. This kind of design also encourages social interaction and fosters a sense of community. It's not just about cramming more people into smaller spaces. It's about creating vibrant, interconnected neighborhoods where people can actually thrive.
So are there any specific examples of how they're implementing this densification strategy in Victoria?
Yeah.
Because it can't be just about plopping down a bunch of skyscrapers in the suburbs, right?
Absolutely not. One interesting approach they're taking is focusing on transit-oriented development.
Transit-oriented development, is that like building housing around train stations and bus stops?
You got it. The idea is to create these hubs where people can easily access public transport, reducing their reliance on cars. And it's not just about housing. They're also encouraging businesses and amenities to cluster around these transit hubs, creating these self-contained mini-cities within the larger urban fabric.
Okay, so they're thinking about more than just housing. They're looking at the whole ecosystem of a neighborhood. That's really cool.
And speaking of ecosystems, another key theme we keep seeing in these reports is sustainability.
Sustainability, yes.
Yeah.
It seems like Victoria is really committed to growing in a way that doesn't completely wreck their environment.
They're very much aware that they're in one of the most beautiful parts of the world, and they want to preserve that. So they're investing heavily in renewable energy sources like solar and wind power. They're also promoting cycling infrastructure and even exploring things like green roofs and urban gardens to mitigate the urban heat island effect.
I love the idea of green roofs. It's like turning the city into a giant park.
It's not quite that simple, but you get the idea. It's about finding ways to integrate nature into the urban environment.
Okay, so they're thinking long term, not just about the immediate needs of the growing population, but about the future of the planet. But isn't all of this incredibly expensive? I mean, we can barely get a new subway line built here in New York.
You're not wrong. These kinds of ambitious projects require massive investment. And that's where Victoria is taking a really interesting approach. They're not just relying on government funding. They're also partnering with private developers and exploring innovative financing models like value capture.
Value capture. What's that?
It's basically a way of tapping into the increased property values that result from these infrastructure improvements. For example, if they build a new train line that makes a particular area more desirable, the property values around that train line will likely go up. And they can then use a portion of that increased value to help fund the project.
So it's like everyone benefits from the improvements, so everyone contributes to the cost.
Exactly. It's a way of making sure that the costs are shared fairly and that the benefits are widely distributed.
Smart. It's like a self-funding urban utopia.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but it's certainly a more sustainable approach than just piling on debt.
Okay, so they're using these projections to plan transportation, housing, and even figuring out how to pay for it all. But isn't there more to creating a city than just the physical infrastructure?
You're absolutely right. A city is more than just bricks and mortar. It's about the people who live there, the communities they form, the experiences they share. And that's where things get even more interesting in Victoria.
Let's unpack that then. What are they doing to make sure that this growth translates into a better quality of life for the people who actually live there?
Well, one area they're focusing on is community engagement. They're not just making decisions behind closed doors, they're actively seeking input from residents, businesses, community groups, everyone who has a stake in the city's future.
That makes a lot of sense. After all, what good is a fancy new tarc if nobody actually wants to use it?
Exactly. They're holding public forums, conducting surveys, even organizing design workshops where people can come and share their ideas. They're trying to make sure that the changes they're making actually align with what the community wants and needs.
So it's not just top-down planning anymore. They're really trying to make people feel like they have a voice in shaping their city.
That's the goal, and it's not always easy. You're always going to have different opinions and priorities, but they're trying to create a more collaborative process, one that values the lived experiences of the people who actually call Victoria home.
I can only imagine the range of opinions they must be getting. It's like trying to herd cats, but with people. But it sounds like they're taking this community engagement thing seriously.
They are. And I think it's a really important step towards creating a more equitable and inclusive city. Because when people feel invested in the process, they're more likely to support the changes and feel a sense of ownership over their community.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're tackling transportation, housing, sustainability, community engagement. Is there anything else they're doing to prepare for this massive population boom?
Well, there are a couple of really cool projects in the works that are worth
I
mentioning.
can tell I love a good urban planning project.
First up, we have the Metro Tunnel. This thing is massive. They're literally digging a whole new underground railway line right through the heart of Melbourne.
An underground railway. That's ambitious.
It is. And it's designed to significantly improve connectivity and reduce congestion on the existing rail network.
Okay, I can see how that would be a game changer, especially with all those extra people coming in. But digging a tunnel under an entire city, that sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It's a huge undertaking for sure, but they've been planning this for years, and they're using some pretty cutting-edge engineering techniques.
Well, I'm definitely adding that to my list of things to check out if I ever make it down under.
You should. It's a marvel of modern engineering.
Okay, so we've got the Metro Tunnel. What else is on the docket?
Next up, we have the Suburban Rail Loop. Now, this one is truly epic in scale.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. Tell me more.
Imagine a brand new 90-kilometer rail loop that encircles Melbourne, connecting all those sprawling suburbs that were once pretty isolated.
90 kilometers, that's like a really long way. What's the thinking behind such a massive project?
It's a multifaceted project with some really ambitious goals. Firstly, it's about improving connectivity and making it easier for people to get around without relying on cars. But it's also about creating new economic opportunities outside the city center.
So instead of everyone piling into downtown Melbourne every day, they're trying to spread things out a bit.
Exactly. The Suburban Rail Loop is designed to create new job hubs and business districts in those outer suburbs, giving people more options for where they live and work. It's also about taking some pressure off the existing infrastructure in the city center.
I can see how that would be beneficial. But isn't there a risk that it could lead to even more sprawl? Like if you make it easier to live further out, won't people just keep pushing the boundaries of the city?
That's a valid concern, and it's something the planners are very aware of. They're trying to design the Suburban Rail Loop in a way that encourages compact, walkable development around the new stations, preventing that kind of leapfrog sprawl you're talking about.
So it's not just about building a train line, it's about shaping the development patterns around it.
Precisely. And they're also integrating it with other sustainability initiatives like bike paths and green spaces to create a truly integrated transportation network.
This is all starting to sound like something out of a futuristic urban planning textbook. It's really impressive to see the level of thought and detail they're putting into all of this.
It is, and we haven't even touched on the social implications of all this growth.
Oh, right. We were talking about demographic projections earlier. What are the key takeaways there?
Well, Victoria is not just experiencing population growth, but also an aging population and a significant influx of migrants.
That's a lot to juggle. How are they planning to accommodate such a diverse and changing population?
Well, one thing they're doing is investing in a wider range of housing options, including more affordable housing and senior living facilities. They're also expanding healthcare services and social programs to meet the needs of this evolving demographic.
So it's about recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach won't work.
Exactly. They're trying to create a city that's inclusive and welcoming to people from all walks of life, regardless of their age, background, or income level.
It's amazing to see how all these different pieces fit together.
Yeah.
It's like they're playing a giant game of urban planning chess, trying to anticipate all the moves and counter moves.
It's a complex challenge for sure, but it's also an incredibly exciting time to be an urban planner, because the decisions they're making today will shape the future of Victoria for generations to come.
This has been a fascinating look into the world of urban planning down under, but before we get too carried away with all this optimism, let's talk about the potential challenges, because let's be honest, even with the best planning, there are always bumps in the road.
Oh, absolutely. And Victoria is facing some unique challenges that could potentially throw a wrench in their plans.
Okay, let's get real here. What are some of the potential roadblocks they might hit?
Well, one of the biggest ones is funding. These large-scale infrastructure projects like the Metro Tunnel and the Suburban Rail Loop are incredibly expensive. And securing the necessary funds can be a major hurdle, especially in a world where budgets are constantly being scrutinized.
Right, so even if you have a great plan, it doesn't mean things will magically fall into place overnight.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of political will. Even if you have the money, it doesn't mean much if the politicians don't have the appetite to see these projects through.
Ah, yes, the dreaded political roadblocks.
And then there are the external factors that are always difficult to predict. Like, remember that little global pandemic we had a few years back?
Oh yeah, 2020 definitely threw everyone a curveball.
It did. And it highlighted the importance of building resilience into our cities. Being able to adapt to unexpected challenges is essential.
Speaking of challenges, one thing that keeps popping up in my mind is the issue of displacement. When you're talking about densifying suburbs and building all these new developments, what happens to the people who are already living there?
That's a critical question, and it's something that planners need to be very mindful of. You don't want these projects to end up pushing out the very people they're supposed to benefit.
So how do you prevent that from happening?
There are a number of strategies. One is to focus on building affordable housing options within these new developments.
So it's not just luxury condos for the wealthy.
No, it needs to be a mix of housing types that cater to a range of incomes. And they need to have policies in place to protect existing residents from being priced out of their homes, like rent control and tenant protections.
So it's all about finding that balance between encouraging growth and protecting the people who are already there. It sounds like a delicate dance.
It is, and it's a dance that cities all over the world are trying to master.
This has been a truly insightful conversation, but unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for now.
But don't worry, urban explorers. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of Victoria's urban future.
Stay tuned for part 2 of our discourse, where we'll delve deeper into the social and environmental implications of this ambitious growth plan.
Until then, keep exploring. Welcome back, urban explorers.
We're picking up our conversation about Victoria, Australia.
A region poised for some serious growth over the next decade.
And as we were discussing before, it's not just about adding more people to the mix.
It's about understanding those people, their needs, and how those needs will shape the city's future.
You know, one thing that really struck me in these reports is how much emphasis they're putting on community engagement.
Absolutely. It's not just top-down planning anymore. They're really trying to get input from residents, businesses, community groups, everyone who has a stake in the city's future.
Because what good is a fancy new park if nobody actually wants to use it?
Exactly. It's about making sure that the changes they're making actually align with what the community wants and needs.
I imagine that can be tricky, right? Because you're always going to have different opinions and priorities.
Of course, that's where the art of urban planning comes in. It's about finding ways to balance those competing interests and create solutions that work for as many people as possible.
So it's not just about crunching numbers and drawing lines on a map. It's about understanding the human side of things.
Very much so, and that's something that Victoria seems to be taking to heart. They've got all sorts of programs in place to encourage community input, from online surveys to public forums to design workshops.
It sounds like they're really trying to make people feel like they have a voice in shaping their city.
And that's crucial because when people feel invested in the process, they're more likely to support the changes and be proud of the place they live.
Makes sense. But let's be honest, no matter how much you plan, there are always going to be unforeseen challenges, right?
Of course, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as a rapidly growing city, there are bound to be bumps along the way.
So what are some of the things that could potentially throw a wrench in their plans?
Well, one thing that always comes up is funding these big infrastructure projects like the Suburban rail loop are incredibly expensive, and securing the necessary funds can be a major hurdle.
Especially in a world where budgets are constantly being scrutinized.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of political will. Even if you have a great plan, it doesn't mean much if the politicians don't have the appetite to see it through.
So you need both the money and the political backing to make these big visions a reality.
Absolutely. And then there are the external factors that you can't always predict, like a global pandemic, for example.
Oh yeah, 2020 definitely threw everyone a curveball.
It did, and it highlighted the importance of building resilience into our cities. Being able to adapt to unexpected challenges is essential.
Speaking of challenges, one thing that keeps popping up in my mind is the issue of displacement. When you're talking about densifying suburbs and building all these new developments, what happens to the people who are already living there?
That's a critical question, and it's something that planners need to be very mindful of. You don't want these projects to end up pushing out the very people they're supposed to benefit.
So how do you prevent that from happening?
There are a number of strategies. One is to focus on building affordable housing options within these new developments.
So it's not just luxury condos for the wealthy.
No, it needs to be a mix of housing types that cater to a range of incomes.
And I imagine things like rent control and tenant protections also come into play.
Absolutely. You need policies in place to prevent people from being priced out of their homes.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it, between encouraging growth and protecting the people who are already there.
Exactly. And that's one of the biggest challenges facing cities all over the world. How do you grow in a way that's both equitable and sustainable?
It's a tough question, but it's one that we need to keep asking, because the choices we make today will have a profound impact on the cities of tomorrow.
Couldn't agree more. And I think the fact that they're having these conversations in Victoria is a positive sign. They're recognizing the challenges, they're engaging with the community, and they're trying to come up with solutions that work for everyone.
It gives you a sense of hope, doesn't it? That maybe, just maybe, we can build cities that are not only functional, but also vibrant, inclusive, and truly livable for all.
And on that note, I think it's time we shift our focus to a different but equally crucial aspect of urban planning.
Ooh, cliffhanger. You got me on the edge of my seat. What's next on our urban exploration agenda?
Let's talk about something that affects every city dweller, but often gets overlooked in the grand schemes of urban development public spaces.
Public spaces, parks, plazas, those little pockets of urban respite that make city life bearable.
Precisely, we often take them for granted, but these spaces play a vital role in the social and psychological well-being of a city. They're where people gather, connect, relax, and escape the hustle and bustle.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
You're saying that as Victoria grows, they need to be thinking about more than just housing and transportation.
Yeah.
They need to be creating spaces for people to actually live and breathe.
Exactly. It's not just about accommodating the physical needs of a growing population. It's about fostering a sense of community and creating a city that's actually enjoyable to live in, and that's where public spaces come in.
All right, I'm sold. Let's talk public spaces. What are some of the things that Victoria is doing to make sure their city remains a vibrant and livable place, even as it grows at this rapid pace?
Hey, urban explorers, welcome back to the Urbanist Lens.
It's great to have you back for the final part of our discourse on Victoria's ambitious plans for the future.
Picking up where we left off, we've been talking about public spaces, parks, plazas, those vital elements of a thriving city.
And how Victoria is recognizing their importance as they plan for this massive population influx.
You know, I've been thinking about our conversation so far, and it's striking how Victoria is trying to create a city that's not just efficient and functional, but also beautiful and enjoyable to live in.
Absolutely. They're not just focused on the practicalities, they're considering the human experience.
Right, and that leads me to something that's been on my mind.
Uh-huh.
How do they balance preserving the existing character and charm of Melbourne while also making room for all these new developments? Ah, the classic urban planning conundrum, how to grow without losing your soul. It's a delicate balance, and I think Victoria is tackling it with a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, first off, they're placing a strong emphasis on heritage preservation. They're identifying those historic buildings and districts that contribute to Melbourne's unique character and ensuring they're protected from demolition or insensitive redevelopment.
So it's about respecting the past while building for the future.
Exactly. And it's not just about preserving individual structures, it's about maintaining the overall feel and fabric of historic neighborhoods.
Which can be tricky when you're trying to increase density.
Very true. But they're finding creative ways to do it. For instance, they're encouraging adaptive reuse of existing buildings.
Adaptive reuse, you mean like converting old factories into apartments or art spaces? I've seen some really cool examples of that here in New York.
Precisely. It's a way to inject new life into historic structures while preserving their architectural heritage. And it often leads to these quirky and unique spaces that you wouldn't find in a brand new development.
So they're finding ways to incorporate the old into the new, which I think is really cool. But what about all the new developments? How do they make sure those don't just become generic glass and steel towers that could be anywhere in the world?
That's where design guidelines come in. They're establishing guidelines that encourage developers to create buildings that are not only functional, but also aesthetically pleasing and contextually sensitive.
So no more cookie-cutter skyscrapers.
Ideally not. They're encouraging things like variations in building heights and materials, green roofs, and public art installations to create a more visually interesting and diverse cityscape.
I can imagine that leads to some interesting negotiations between the city and the developers.
Oh, for sure. It's a constant back and forth, but I think it's ultimately leading to better outcomes. They're finding ways to balance the economic realities of development with the desire to create a city that's both beautiful and livable.
Speaking of livability, we've talked a lot about the physical aspects of the city, but what about the social fabric? How do they ensure that this growth doesn't lead to social isolation and inequality?
That's another crucial consideration, and it's something they're addressing through a variety of initiatives.
Such as?
Well, for starters, they're investing heavily in community facilities and programs. Think libraries, community centers, sports fields, arts organizations, the kinds of spaces and programs that bring people together and foster a sense of belonging.
So creating those third places outside of home and work where people can connect and interact.
Exactly, and they're making sure these facilities are distributed equitably throughout the city so that everyone has access to them, regardless of where they live or their income level.
That's really important. It's about creating a city where everyone feels connected and has the opportunity to thrive.
Absolutely. And they're also focusing on creating a sense of place within these new developments.
What do you mean by sense of place?
It's about creating neighborhoods that have their own unique identity and character. Think local shops, cafes, community gardens, public art that reflects the history and culture of the area. These are the things that make a place feel like home rather than just a collection of buildings.
I love that. It's about creating those little pockets of charm and personality that make a city truly special.
Exactly. And it's something that takes time and effort to cultivate. It's not just about the physical design, it's about fostering a sense of community and ownership among the residents.
So it's not just the planners and developers who have a role to play. It's also up to the people who live there to shape their neighborhoods and make them their own.
Absolutely. It's a collaborative effort. And I think Victoria is doing a great job of creating the conditions for that kind of community-driven development to flourish.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful discourse. I've learned so much about how Victoria is planning for the future and all the different factors they're considering.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you and with all our urban explorers out there.
And speaking of our urban explorers, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Victoria's approach to urban planning. What resonates with you? What challenges do you see? Share your comments on our social media channels. We'd love to continue the conversation.
And if you're interested in learning more about urban planning and how cities around the world are tackling the challenges of growth and development, be sure to subscribe to the Urbanist Lens. We've got some fascinating episodes lined up, exploring everything from sustainable transportation to the future of housing.
Until then, keep exploring and stay curious about the cities we inhabit.
See you in the next episode.